have some big questions for God? If so, you're in the right place. Let's talk about it with John Hopper on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
Hey, we're so glad you're here, and I say it every week and mean it every week. Well, maybe not every week I mean it, but most of the times I mean it. You have a place at our table, a seat at our table to join us for a great hour of conversation. In case you're wondering, I'm Steve, the old white guy. Matthew Porter, our executive producer, is here. Matthew says he's been diagnosed with acute apathy. Matthew, is there a cure for that?
I don't know. Maybe. Okay.
Sure is.
And our producer, Jinx, is in his little glass booth. Jinx thinks that we should bring dinosaurs back to life, then kill them to make more oil, so we can bring the gas prices back down.
Well, I have a question, though. Do we get Brontosaurus burgers?
Do what?
Can we make Brontosaurus burgers?
Good question.
Be ashamed not to.
Well, it depends on how much you want the gasoline prices down and how many dinosaurs you have to use.
Just out of the tail.
Not as simple as it sounds.
Might take a while.
But it works for me. Our video director, John Myers, is in his little tech booth, or his big tech booth. John edits out any mistakes we make, and that's why this program is so short. And Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. He isn't like a, regular doctor. George says, turn your head and cough up some cash for Key Life. And Kathy Wyatt, of course, is here, the soft feminine side of the program. Some of you don't know this, but she swims many laps every morning before most of you get up. This morning, Kathy, I wondered if you swam laps or did you ice skate?
I tell you, I believe that it was 39 actually here in Orlando. And I believe I heard my pool heater say, I'm doing the best I can. You might think about waiting till later. So I'm going to do that. Yeah, I got my foot in up to my ankle and said, yeah, this is not going to work today. So.
You're amazing, Kathy. I don't know how you do it. It takes everything I've got just to get out of bed. But then I'm older than you are.
See, now you know how I feel.
And you're no spring chicken. So
that's right.
You have my admiration. Our guest today is John Hopper, and he serves as an area director for Search Ministries. And that's a great ministry, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. He's in Houston. Prior to that, John worked in the private sector, first as a tennis pro, and then later in real estate. And after transitioning into full-time ministry, he was smoking pot at the time and a little bit crazy.
Fake news.
John served for 16 years as a pastor of BridgePoint Bible Church in Houston. And that was all he could take. John holds degrees from Trinity University, the University of Houston, Bethel University, and Biola University. And John's new book, which if we had, but he was too cheap to send it. And I would hold it in my nicotine-stained hands. You're simply going to have to use your imagination. The title of the book is Questioning God, Answers to Questions Worth Asking. And I want to correct John's not cheap. He graciously because we had some connections with his sisters, who's one of our bloggers. We got him at the last minute, and we didn't have time to get a copy of the book. Now, that doesn't absolutely prove that he's not cheap. He may be, but the fact that we don't have books does not suggest that. John, thank you for taking your time and spending it with us.
Well, it's great to be with you, Steve. And I'm glad you cleared that up about me being cheap. I hope you clear up the pot smoking too.
We're gonna leave that on the
that
table.
Was true. The book thing was kind of a joke. Well, there's
for a price, we could take it out.
What'd you say?
For a price, we could take it out.
Yeah, right. You know, you got to be crazy to go into pastoral ministry anyway.
Yeah.
I wake up in the morning. I did it for 25, 30 years.
Well, you're more crazy than I was.
Oh, I know. Listen, and I kept asking Jesus to let me out of it. And he wouldn't. And when he did, I'm doing this now. And I wake up in the morning, do not swim. But if it's cloudy and rainy and it's going to be a depressing day, I say to myself, you know, this could be a lot worse. I could still be a pastor. John, a number of years ago, I had lunch with a late Larry King. And during the lunch, he always asked questions. He was asking questions about my faith. He was, at that time, I think as he crammed for finals, he got a little closer to God. But at that time, he was an agnostic, sometimes an atheist. So he asked me these questions, and I said, Larry, I can answer those questions, but I need to ask you a question first. If I answer every one of your questions, will you then become a Christian and announce that across the country on your program? There was dead silence. I said, do you just like to ask questions? If you want answers, I'll give them, but I'm not going to do it for the fun of it. And he laughed. And then he said something interesting. He said, nobody ever asked me that before. He said, I'll get back to you on that. And he never did. Do you sometimes wonder in your ministry, and I want to find out about Search because that's a dynamite ministry, but you ever get the feeling that the questions that are posed are not real questions, but a smokescreen? Because if there's a God, he's in charge. And if there's not, I'm in charge.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I wrote this book because people do have questions. And I think that reasonable questions deserve reasonable answers. But at the same time, I don't think that it's just answers to questions that will move people along. So I think there are other hurdles. And the way that I like to describe it, and at Search, we like to describe it, is we say in some cases, there's emotional hurdles. There's people that have been hurt. They've been hurt by circumstances. They've been hurt by Christians, by the church. And so those are really the hurdles that are keeping them from taking a step forward. And other people, it is the questions that I address in this book. But then there are other people where it doesn't really matter whether they get answers to questions, or even if they have no sort of emotional hurdles, they just want to keep their hands on the steering wheel. And as long as they want to keep their hands on the steering wheel, it doesn't matter what answers you give them.
A number of years ago, R.C. Sproul wrote a book called, and I don't even know if it's still in print, but it was titled The Psychology of Atheism. And the theme of that book was, whenever you encounter unbelief because the fool has said in his heart there's no God, and you're willing to look into the past, you'll find something there that's traumatic, that has caused pain, that is unrelated to the intellectual problems that one has with the Christian faith. We're going to get into some specifics on that, but tell us something about Search.
So Search is a ministry that's been around for several decades now, and it's really centered on relational evangelism. And what we mean by that is, oftentimes Christians are trying to get those who don't believe into sort of their venues, into their church, to their sort of church and Christian events. And many people aren't going to walk through those doors, especially these days. And so Search has always been about getting on people's turf, going to where they are, where they're comfortable. That might be in their home. That might be in their country club. It might be inside their business. It might be, it could be at a bar. It could be at a restaurant, whatever the case might be. But getting to those places where people are comfortable, where they feel like, hey, they can ask their questions. And so that's what Search has been about for all of these years. And it's exciting to be a part of that on a day-to-day basis.
I was a pastor of a church, and we supported Search in those early days when it was getting started, sending professors on university campuses, watching pagans cave when they confronted with people who knew what they were talking about and had their same credentials. And I love you guys and your faithfulness and the way God is using you in so many lives. Guys, you don't want to miss a bit of this. The name of the book, and you might want to get it for a small group in your church, is Questioning God, Answers to Questions Worth Asking. So don't go anywhere, because like Jesus, we're going to return. Hey, we're so glad you're here, and we're talking to author John Hopper. His new book is called Questioning God, Answers to Questions Worth Asking.
John, we're going to get into some of the specific questions and all from the book, but from a broad kind of overview kind of point of view, it seems like this book is a little bit different than a lot of apologetics books. Care to explain that approach?
And so I think a lot of apologetics books, and this isn't the case for all of them, but many of them are written to Christians. So here's Christian, here's how you answer the question that someone who's not a Christian might ask. And so if you were to give that book to a non-Christian, it would seem very almost as if that person was a project, right? So, and they can even have a little bit of a combative tone to them. So this book is written as though the person reading it is the person who really has the questions, who isn't there yet, isn't on the same page as the Christian. So it has a very different tone. And it, again, it's because it assumes that the person who's, that these questions are really being asked by the person reading it, you can feel very free to give it away to somebody who isn't yet a believer without them feeling like they're sort of a project in the midst of it.
That's good.
They are sort of a project, aren't they?
We're all kind of a project.
I mean, go into all the world kind of thing. I think Jesus said something like that, because there are projects everywhere. As you go, make disciples. I'm being facetious, of course.
John, are you finding that there's one or two questions that come up more often than others? And does that vary with sort of like demographic or age group kinds of things? So younger people tend to ask, a particular question more often, and older or something like that. Are you seeing those kinds of reactions?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question, George. And I think that, well, first of all, we chose the 15 questions in this book because these are questions that we get asked so regularly as a search staff team across the country. But, kinds of questions a particular person would ask, it can vary significantly. And there is a sort of an order to the chapters even in the book, right? So it's beginning with questions about God. Can we even believe that God exists? And some people are at that place, right? But some people are fine with there being some supreme being, but they don't have much confidence in the scriptures. So there's questions there. And then others who might say, okay, I'm pretty good with the Bible, but what about, right? So we sort of deal with questions along those lines. So there's differences that way, but there probably are some, differences in terms of, say, even age. You might have from a younger crowd more questions in regards to science issues. So doesn't science disprove God or disprove the Bible? Whereas older people, they're going to be more likely to ask the question in regards to pain and suffering. Because they've experienced more of it. And I certainly see that. So you're much more likely for a 60-year-old to ask questions about where's God with the pain and suffering than a 20-year-old or a 15-year-old. So you see that as well. Now, one question that I've seen just sort of really move along in the last few years is the question about, is Jesus really the only way? How can you say that? So that was a question that existed before, but to me, it's really come to the forefront because of sort of the plurality of our culture. So that one's become much more frequent.
You deal with social issues a lot?
We do deal with some social issues, and that also kind of depends on the sort of the group of people you might be with. So you might, if I'm in an area of Houston, for example, that's more conservative, even though they may not be Christian, but they're generally hold more conservative values, then maybe, certain social issues don't come up. But you can go to other parts of Houston where, issues of, say, sexuality or whatever become at the forefront. So just even from one neighborhood to another or a few miles apart from one another, the questions can change in terms of their importance.
We had Eric Metaxas on a few weeks ago about his book, Is Atheism Dead? That's a very large book and kind of an obscene gesture in the face of pagans, which I guess there's a place for. I mean, to be in your face, smoke that. How do you like that kind of thing? And Eric does a good job with that. But there is a delicacy in the care and feeding of pagans, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I think that we don't want to, in the process of answering people's questions or giving them information or reasons to throw up new emotional hurdles, right? So they got the answers to their questions, but now they hate you. So that usually doesn't sort of, move someone along. So we can remove one hurdle, but build another one. And so I think it's important that we give good answers, but we do it in a way that sort of reduces both hurdles, the emotional hurdle and an intellectual hurdle.
So there's something to be said for winsomeness on the part of the apologist. Kathy, I think you have some things to say. We may not be able to get an answer, but we can at least pose the question before the break.
Yeah. John, I am in these big questions that you delve into in the book. Back in the dark ages, years and years ago, when I was in Bible college, one of the questions that came up and people really wanted to have some kind of a handle on is, how do you deal with and how does God deal with people who have never had the opportunity to hear? Bringing up somebody in the middle of Africa who's never had a missionary come and explain the quote plan of salvation to them, et cetera, and so forth. What can you expand on that one a little bit? Because I think that's still, it may not be worded in exactly that same way, in this day and age, but I think it's definitely, still something that comes into play, and we are actually coming up on a break, so we might have to get into it on the other side of it, but I'm curious about that one.
Yeah, well, I'll make one short comment and then we'll come back to it after the break. And that is, when someone asks this question, I'm always really happy because it means that they've understood really the core message of Christianity. You see, they don't ask it unless they understand that we're saying that Jesus is the only way. And so now they're saying, well, if Jesus is the only way, what about people who haven't heard? And so I always like to just sort of mention, I think it's real positive that they're asking the question, because it means they've kind of understood what we're after.
Good stuff.
We're going to make him answer the question,
reformed,
though, when we get back.
which means I believe in election, and which means that I don't have to worry about that much. Jesus is going to hug whoever he wants. And if you believe in the Ordo Salutis, you know, he may hug somebody before they have a chance to hear about Jesus. Who knows? But I'll give you a chance to explore that issue, because we all have questions at that point. Tell you what, if you go away and you don't listen to the rest of this, you're going to get the hives. So we'll be back. Thanks for joining us on Steve Brown, etc. We're hanging out with author John Hopper, and you can keep up with him at questioninggod.com. That's questioninggod.com. Kathy, why don't you bring up that question again?
Yeah. John, the issue that we brought up and you just were able to touch on it a little bit is the issue of what about people who have never heard, have never had the opportunity to hear, and where do we go with that? And, you know, does God judge them, and et cetera and so forth? So if you pick up on that a little bit, that'd be great.
Well, first of all, Callie, I think that's a pretty big assumption for us to make, the assumption that people haven't heard. So I think what we see in Scripture is that people have heard. It doesn't mean they've heard all the same things or the same amount, but they've heard, I would say, enough. So one of the things that we see in Scripture is that God has made himself clear through his creation, right? So we ought to look at sort of the magnificence of creation and say there's got to be somebody behind this. In fact, that's really the intuitive response of humans, and it has been all along, that there needs to be someone out there. We almost have to be educated out of that position. In fact, the research shows that there's this intuitive sense there's got to be something out there. So we've all been told that. And then we also have this pesky little thing called conscience. So that regardless of kind of what your conscience might be telling you, we tend to not live up to our conscience, no matter sort of what the standard is we set there. And that in and of itself should say, hey, not only is there something out there, but I don't seem to be able to sort of live up to any sort of code or standard. So maybe I'm not in such a great place with the one who created all of this. So in that sense, I think we've all heard that. Okay. Now, what I see in Scripture often is that when people lean into that understanding, that God has this magnificent way of getting them more information. So one way that I sort of look at it is if I'm teaching tennis to someone and I start to tell them a few things and they're like, yeah. Then I may not tell them anymore because they're not really that interested in hearing what I have to say. But if they lean into what I've said and they're like, oh yeah, that's really helpful, that's great, then I want to tell them more. And we tend to see that in Scripture as well. I mean, one great example is the example of the Ethiopian eunuch who's in his chariot. He's reading the prophet Isaiah, but he can't understand what he's hearing. And God just manages to get Philip there in order to explain Isaiah to him and explain who Jesus is, who's being prophesied as the Messiah. And I think we have some wonderful stories around the world of people who lean into what God has revealed about himself, and God magnificently getting more to those. It could be through radio. It could be through, some mission sort of effort. It can be through someone walking along a road and finding a couple pages of the Bible. Lots of those kinds of stories. And we're finding those stories in very remote places, whether it be in the sort of the high country of India, or whether it be in the Middle East, or whether it be in sort of more jungle settings. We see those kinds of stories happening, and perhaps we put too much limits on God, as if He cannot get His message to places.
Mm-hmm. You remember the book Eternity in Their Hearts?
I do.
That's a great book. And it
is a very good book,
showing how culturally Jesus is present and is there ahead of any missionary or anybody who shows. But bottom line, you're simply saying God's fair and He's just. And, we don't have the answer to all of these questions, but we can trust Him to do what is right.
I think so. And I think, too, we can sometimes be culpably ignorant. What I mean by that is there can be times where we don't know what we should know. So, all right. So, if we get something in the mail and we have to put it together, maybe we've ordered something from IKEA and we just start to build it without reading the instructions, and it all falls apart and it breaks, and we take it in and we say, this all broke. Well, did you follow the instructions? No. So we're culpably ignorant at that point, right? So, and there are times, right, when God has revealed Himself through creation, through conscience, maybe through some other avenues, and we've just shut it off. And so we don't get to know the more about Jesus than perhaps we ought to know. And so we say, well, those people never heard, but perhaps in those situations, they're actually culpably ignorant because they've pressed back on what they could have known from what they've been shown already.
When you said that when you're talking to somebody and they go, yeah, they don't care. And they have an intentional not caring. And so you don't tell them anymore. That's sort of the shaking the dust off your feet principle, isn't it?
It is a little bit that way. Yeah.
Sometimes, there are people that really do want to hear, that have real questions, who are going through painful and sinful and marginalized time. And so it becomes of existential importance that they get answers to their questions. And I'm not going to spend my time with yeah, when there are people who really want to hear. Jesus said, right on. Don't do that. Shake the dust off your feet and go speak to somebody who cares. That's a loose translation, but accurate. Guys, we're going to come back. You do too. Hey, we're glad you're with us. We're talking to John Hooper, and we're talking about apologetics is what we're talking about, but seen through a different light, questions that people have about God. John, you guys have a podcast, don't you?
We do. But Steve, you're always making jokes, so I'm sure you threw in my name Hooper just to sort of get me off since it's Hopper. I understand.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was debating which it was at the beginning, and I'm old. I'm doing the best I can. Sorry.
That's all right. So there is a podcast that goes along with the book. It's called the Questioning God Podcast. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever, or thequestion.com website. And there's 15 episodes, and there's one episode that goes along with each chapter of the book. They're only 15 or 20 minutes long. The idea is just for listeners to be able to sort of understand sort of the high points of the chapter. And I'm being interviewed in those podcasts. And it's just if you just can't read it all, but you want to sort of understand some of the content of the book, it's a sort of a great resource.
What's the name of the podcast again? So people
the Questioning God podcast.
Okay.
Yeah.
John, I think sort of following up in general in the theme that we were discussing before, since you guys sort of take the posture, it sounds like that we're asking questions, we're trying to answer questions that are asked. We aren't necessarily trying to impose answers before the questions are asked. Nevertheless, it does seem like for probably increasingly over the past several decades, people sort of take the position that of a non-objective truth. I mean, there is no objective truth kind of thing. So I'm wondering if a typical response might be, in some cases, well, that may be true for you, or that may be your narrative, or I have a different narrative, or something along that line. What kind of responses do you, get in that kind of situation?
Well, if they do suggest, for example, that they have sort of a different narrative, sort of a different way of understanding things, then one of the things I would do is simply try to explore what it is that they do believe. So, sometimes I think as Christians, we're too quick to defend our position when other people have maybe made the claims themselves. So, for example, if they've even made the claim, well, there is no truth. So, well, they really have to defend that claim because they're the ones who made it, right? So, and we often sort of maybe too quickly defend our position. So I try to help, I try to understand what it is that they hold on to or why they believe what they believe. So that kind of probably would be my first step. In regards to sort of the truth question, is there truth? What I try to help people to see is that every day we make decisions as to what is true. So we don't walk through our days saying, well, we just don't know what is true, or what's true for you is true for you, but not true for me. So, if you're on a flight that's, supposed to go to Philly, but for some reason, because of weather or whatever, it touches down in Baltimore, right? So, and you're told that, you've landed in Baltimore, but half of the people on the plane are saying, no, this is Philly. And the other half says, no, it's really Baltimore. So people in that situation would not say, well, it's true for you that it's Philadelphia, but it's true for me that it's Baltimore, right? So we don't make that decision. We don't come to that kind of conclusion throughout our days in all kinds of ways. And so I'm simply asking people to think like they think in their everyday decisions. So they don't think that, the cereal they ate this morning is poisonous or that it's healthy, and what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. They don't sort of think that way. And so I'm just trying to get them to sort of say, well, maybe that's the same in regards to God as well, that God is, he's either real or he isn't real. It's not a truth that's just held by me or held by you.
So, when you must be asked millions of questions, especially being around as long as you have, tell us a little bit how you address a situation where you may not have an immediate answer.
That's great. That's really good, and I think that's probably really good for your listeners because, right, I get asked a lot
of things that I don't have the answer to.
That's right. In fact, I think a lot of Christians are afraid of getting into conversations with other people. They've told me this because, what if I get asked a question and I don't know how to answer it? I think that the way to respond to that is to say, that is a really good question, and I want to think about it. And I just don't want to give you sort of a knee-jerk sort of answer to your question. When you do that, you honor the person who's asked the question. Then, of course, you need to go think about it. Right? So you need to read a book like Questioning God or some other apologetic book that kind of gives you a good answer to that question. Begin to formulate your answer. Then come back to them, say it's 2 weeks later, and simply say, that question you asked, I've been thinking about that. Most likely the response is going to be, you have? Like people feel like you maybe just sort of walked away, but now you're double honoring them because you're coming back with an answer. And then here's what's key is that when you give that answer, when you come back to them, is to offer it, I would say, what I call tentatively. In other words, rather than saying, here's the answer to your question, is to say, here's how I've been thinking about it. Let me tell you how I've sort of answered that question, and you tell me what you think. And now what you've done is you're able to offer an answer to the question, but you've created an atmosphere for a conversation. So as soon as you've given some sort of answer, you're able to say, so what do you think? Does that make sense to you? Or is that weird or what? And now you're in a dialogue and you have this friendly conversation about the question that they asked, and you didn't have to know the answer on the spot. So I think sort of going that way can be really fruitful.
Is it okay sometimes to say, I just don't know?
Yeah. So you can say, I don't know, but, I want to think about that. Because sometimes we say, I don't know, maybe because we don't know, or like you can't be known, but oftentimes there is a reasonable answer to a question, and we just don't happen to have it on the top of our head.
But sometimes, since we're finite and God's infinite, confusion plays well, and authenticity about that can play well too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. John, we're out of time. I don't know where it went. This has been a great hour, and we appreciate your taking your time from a busy schedule to be with us. And I hope we can do it again.
It's been great to be with you, Steve, and the rest of you as well.
All right. I hope everybody has put on their thinking cap and begun to think about questions that people ask. You really have to get the book, Questioning God, Answers to Questions Worth Asking. It's a very good book to have in your library. But once you buy it, don't sit on it and give it to some pagan somewhere and say, I dare you to read this, and then get out of the way and see what God does. Guys, we're going to come back and tell you who we're going to do it unto next week. And you'll be surprised, so don't go anywhere. We as Christians are really called to be leaven in the loaf, salt in the meat. And we're often just a lump of salt or a lump of leaven. And one of the reasons we don't get involved in the world with people who are unbelievers, get involved in organizations that are not Christian organizations, is because we have believed a lie. And the lie is that they read books, are thoughtful or profound, and they're going to eat you alive. Let me tell you, that's a lie. It's just not true. You'll find that the hardest thing to deal with when you're trying to talk about Jesus to unbelievers is to keep from saying that's stupid. I can't believe that somebody with the brain of amoeba, have you never read a book? But you will be surprised, because all of the myths that we have about unbelievers are often untrue. So get John's book and read it. But that won't prepare you. Just be who you are. The people who get the power in meetings are the people who are willing to show and stay until it's over. Christians need to get that in our hearts, to show at the corner bar, to show at an organization that's doing good work but doesn't like Jesus, to show in places where they don't expect us to show, and then create questions by our showing And then have at least minimal answers to those questions, and you'll be surprised. This is not an intellectual game. I think the Christian faith intellectually makes sense. And I think if you want to debate it in that kind of form, and the Christian knows what they're talking about, they'll win every time. But that's not the issue. This is a supernatural battle. And God uses people who say, I don't know enough and I'm not good enough. Of course you don't know enough. I've been doing this all my life and I don't know enough. Of course you're not good enough. Nobody is. Good Hour with John. Get the book and read it. Kathy, who's going to be on next week?
Next week, we have Jonathan Lehman. He is the co-author of a book which is titled Rediscover Church, Why the Body of Christ is Essential, which I think is a really, really great topic now as we're coming hopefully out of the pandemic, et cetera, and people have been going to church online, and do we really want to go back, and why is it important, and all of that.
That'll be great. If you're running with the cool kids, it's kind of in to say bad things about the church. We'll give you another perspective next week, so you join us. Same time, same place. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide, wide berth.